The winter winds of 1885 howled through Copper Ridge like the cries of lost souls, carrying with them the scent of desperation and the promise of death. In the flickering candlelight of St. Michael's Church, Rebecca Morgan clutched her son Tommy's trembling hand as Father O'Brien's voice rose above the storm. The congregation huddled together for warmth, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air, while outside the blizzard raged with supernatural fury. But it wasn't the cold that made Rebecca's blood freeze in her veins. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It was the sight of Jake Sullivan filling the church doorway like a mountain come to life, his massive frame blocking out what little light filtered through the frost-covered windows. The giant of Copper Ridge had come calling, and everyone knew that when Big Jake Sullivan wanted something, the very earth trembled beneath his boots. The morning sun painted the Colorado Territory in shades of gold and crimson as Rebecca Morgan stood at the edge of her failing homestead, watching the last of her cattle disappear into the distance. 3 years of drought had turned her late husband's dream into a nightmare of cracked earth and broken promises. The bank notice crumpled in her weathered hands told the story in cold, merciless numbers. 2 weeks. That's all the time she had before Sheriff Crawford would come with his deputies to take everything she and Tommy had left in this world. Her fingers traced the faded wedding ring that hung on a chain around her neck, the only thing of value she hadn't already sold or traded for food. Michael had been dead 6 months now, taken by a fever that Doc Henderson couldn't cure with all his medicines and prayers. The consumption had hollowed him out from the inside, leaving Rebecca with a 4-year-old son, a mortgage she couldn't pay, and skills that were worthless in a man's world where women were expected to remarry or perish. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Rebecca's heart race with familiar dread. Creditors, she thought, or perhaps Sheriff Crawford had decided not to wait the full 2 weeks. But as the dust cloud grew larger, she realized this was something different entirely. The rider approaching her homestead was enormous, sitting astride a black stallion that looked more like a creature from mythology than any horse she'd ever seen. Even from a distance there was no mistaking the identity of the man who owned half the territory and controlled the other half through fear and influence. Jake Sullivan dismounted with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle, his boots hitting the ground with a sound like thunder. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of mountains, he was everything the stories claimed and more. His hair, dark as a moonless night, fell to his shoulders, framing a face that could have been carved from granite. But it was his eyes that held Rebecca frozen in place. Pale blue like winter ice, they seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Mrs. Morgan," Jake said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that might have been respectful if not for the predatory smile that played at the corners of his mouth. "I believe we need to have a conversation." Rebecca's throat felt dry as desert sand, but she forced herself to speak. "Mr. Sullivan, I wasn't expecting company." She glanced toward the house where Tommy was napping, praying her son would stay inside and out of sight. "I imagine you weren't," Jake replied, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated buildings and barren fields. "Though I suspect you've been expecting someone. The bank perhaps." Sheriff Crawford with an eviction notice. The casual way he mentioned her deepest fears told Rebecca everything she needed to know. Jake Sullivan was here because he knew exactly how desperate her situation had become. In a territory where information was power, the giant of Copper Ridge made it his business to know everyone's secrets. "What do you want?" Rebecca asked, lifting her chin with what little dignity she had left. Jake's smile widened, revealing teeth as white and sharp as a wolf's. "Straight to the point, I like that in a woman." He took a step closer and Rebecca had to resist the urge to flee. "Your husband owed me money, Mrs. Morgan, a considerable sum as it happens." "That's impossible," Rebecca protested. "Michael never borrowed from you, he would have told me." "Would he?" Jake's voice carried a hint of amusement. "Men do foolish things when they're desperate, Mrs. Morgan. Your husband came to me last winter when the bank refused to extend his credit. He needed money for seed, for medicine when the fever took hold. I was generous in my terms." Rebecca felt the world spinning around her. "How much, with interest?" $5,000. The number hit Rebecca like a physical blow. It might as well have been 5 million. Even if she sold everything she owned, including the clothes on her back, she couldn't raise a fraction of that amount. "I don't have that kind of money," she whispered. "I know," Jake said simply. "But I'm a reasonable man, Mrs. Morgan. I didn't come here to collect a debt from a widow and her child." He paused, letting his words sink in. I came here with a proposition. Rebecca's hands trembled as she wrapped her arms around herself. What kind of proposition? Jake's pale eyes seemed to glow in the morning light. I need a wife, Mrs. Morgan. Someone to manage my household, to provide me with sons to carry on the Sullivan name. In return I would pay off your debts, provide for your boy, give you a life of comfort and security. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Rebecca stared at this giant of a man, trying to process what he was offering. Marriage to Jake Sullivan would solve all her immediate problems, but it would also chain her to a man whose reputation was built on violence and ruthless ambition. I know what people say about me, Jake continued, as if reading her thoughts. They call me a monster, a tyrant who rules this territory through fear. Some of those stories are even true. His expression softened slightly. But I've never raised a hand to a woman or child, Mrs. Morgan. I give you my word that you and your son would be safe under my protection. And if I refuse, Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer, then Sheriff Crawford will be here in 2 weeks to seize your property for unpaid debts. You'll be homeless in the dead of winter with a child to care for and no means of support. Jake's voice remained perfectly calm, as if he were discussing the weather. How long do you think you'd survive on the streets of Copper Ridge? Rebecca closed her eyes, feeling the trap closing around her like iron jaws.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She thought of Tommy sleeping peacefully in his bed, unaware that his mother was about to make a bargain that would change both their lives forever. When she opened her eyes again, Jake was watching her with the patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course, Jake nodded. Take all the time you need. I'll be back tomorrow for your answer. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back over his shoulder. Mrs. Morgan, I should mention that I'm not the only one interested in your situation. There are men in this territory who would see you and your boy as opportunities. My protection extends beyond just financial security. With that ominous warning, Jake Sullivan mounted his massive stallion and rode away, leaving Rebecca alone with the weight of an impossible choice. As the dust settled, she sank to her knees in the dirt of her failed homestead, tears streaming down her face as she contemplated a future that offered only the illusion of choice between different forms of captivity. The sun was setting behind Thunder Ridge when Sam Mitchell rode into Copper Ridge, his weathered face and trail-worn clothes marking him as a drifter. He'd been following rumors of work, of a place where a man with certain skills might find employment, but what he found instead was a town held in the grip of fear. The streets were nearly empty despite the early hour, and those few souls brave enough to venture outside moved quickly, their eyes downcast, their voices hushed. Sam had seen towns like this before, during his years as a lawman in Kansas, and later as a gun for hire in the New Mexico territory. Places where one man held too much power, where justice was whatever the strongest man said it was. He'd sworn off that life after the incident in Tombstone, after he'd learned the hard way that sometimes the law and justice were two very different things. The Silver Dollar Saloon sat at the heart of Copper Ridge, like a diseased organ, its bat-winged doors opening and closing as men stumbled in and out, seeking liquid courage or liquid forgetfulness. Sam tied his horse to the hitching post and pushed through the doors, his hand resting casually on the grip of his Colt Peacemaker. The conversations died as he entered, dozens of eyes measuring him, weighing whether he was friend, foe, or something else entirely. Help you, stranger. The bartender was a thin man with nervous eyes and shaking hands, clearly not someone who'd chosen his profession by preference. Whiskey, Sam replied, laying a silver dollar on the scarred wooden bar. And information if you're selling. Information comes dear in these parts, the bartender said, pouring a generous measure of amber liquid. Depends on what you're looking to know. Work, Sam said simply. Heard there might be opportunities for a man with my particular skills. The bartender's eyes flicked nervously toward a table in the corner where 3 men sat playing cards. One of them, a heavy-set man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest, looked up at the mention of work. What kind of skills would those be? Sheriff Crawford called out, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man who'd never been challenged. Sam turned slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, the kind that kept me alive through the Lincoln County War and the Pleasant Valley conflict, the kind that made certain men very nervous in Dodge City and Tombstone. A murmur ran through the saloon at the mention of those notorious conflicts. Sheriff Crawford's eyes narrowed as he studied Sam more carefully, trying to place him in the catalog of dangerous men who drifted through the territory. "Sam Mitchell," the sheriff said finally, recognition dawning in his voice. "Heard you were dead. Disappointed?" Sam asked, downing his whiskey in one smooth motion. Crawford laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Not particularly. Dead men don't earn wages, and Mr. Sullivan always has use for men with your reputation." The mention of Sullivan's name sent another ripple through the crowd. Sam filed the information away, beginning to understand the dynamics of power in Copper Ridge. "And what kind of work would Mr. Sullivan have for someone like me?" "The kind that pays well and doesn't ask too many questions," Crawford replied. "Assuming you're still in that line of business." Sam considered this carefully. He'd come to Copper Ridge looking for honest work, but honest work was scarce in the territories, and his savings were running dangerously low. Whatever Jake Sullivan needed men like him for, it probably wasn't anything Sam would be proud of, but pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. "When do I meet him?" Sam asked. "Tomorrow morning," Crawford said. "Iron Crown Ranch, about 5 miles north of town. You can't miss it. Just look for the biggest damn house this side of Denver." Sam nodded, finishing his drink and dropping another coin on the bar. "Much obliged." As he turned to leave, Crawford called out again, "Mitchell, word of advice. Mr. Sullivan appreciates loyalty above all else. Men who work for him tend to have long, prosperous careers. Men who cross him," he shrugged eloquently. "I'll keep that in mind," Sam replied, pushing back through the bat-wing doors into the cooling evening air. He found lodging at Mitchell's boarding house, a coincidence of names that amused the elderly proprietor, Widow Patterson. She was a round, grandmotherly woman with kind eyes, and a suspicious nature, the sort who'd survived frontier life by knowing when to speak and when to listen. "You're not here for the usual reasons," she observed as she showed him to a small but clean room on the second floor. "What are the usual reasons?" Sam asked, setting his saddlebags on the narrow bed. "Most men come to Copper Ridge for one of 3 things," Widow Patterson replied. "They're running from something, they're looking to get rich quick, or they're here to work for Jake Sullivan. You don't look like you're running, and you're too smart to think there's easy money in these mountains." "That leaves the third option," Sam said. "Maybe," she allowed, "but there's something different about you. Most of Sullivan's men have a particular look about them. Hard men who've seen too much and done worse. You've got the hard part down, but there's something else, something almost like." "Like what?" "Like conscience," she said simply. "That's a dangerous thing to have in Copper Ridge, Mr. Mitchell. Men with consciences tend to ask uncomfortable questions, and uncomfortable questions tend to have unpleasant consequences." Sam studied the old woman's face, recognizing the wisdom that came from surviving in a place where survival was never guaranteed. "What can you tell me about Sullivan?" Widow Patterson glanced around nervously, even though they were alone in the hallway. "Nothing that wouldn't get us both killed if the wrong person heard it," she said finally. "But I will say this, Jake Sullivan is the kind of man who takes what he wants and destroys what he can't have. If you're smart, you'll finish whatever business brought you here and move on before you learn too much about how things really work in this territory." With that cryptic warning, she left Sam alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that he'd stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple job opportunity. Through his window, he could see the lights of the Iron Crown Ranch twinkling in the distance like fallen stars, and he wondered what kind of man commanded such wealth and power in a place where both were usually taken by force. As the night deepened around Copper Ridge, Sam Mitchell cleaned his weapons and tried to quiet the voice in his head that whispered warnings about the choices he was about to make. Somewhere in the darkness, a woman named Rebecca Morgan was facing her own impossible choice, and a giant named Jake Sullivan was planning moves in a game where the stakes were measured in lives and souls. The dawn would bring answers, but Sam had learned long ago that in places like Copper Ridge, the answers were usually more dangerous than the questions. The morning mist clung to the valleys like the breath of sleeping giants as Sam Mitchell rode toward the Iron Crown Ranch, his horse's hooves drumming a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. The landscape around him spoke of immense wealth and careful cultivation, from the pristine white fences that stretched as far as the eye could see to the fat cattle that grazed in pastures green as emeralds. This wasn't just a ranch, Sam realized as he crested the final hill. This was an empire carved from the wilderness by will and force. The main house rose before him like a monument to ambition, its 3 stories of imported stone and timber dwarfing everything else in the valley. Wrap-around porches adorned with intricate woodwork suggested comfort and refinement, while the gun towers flanking the main entrance spoke of more practical concerns. Sam counted at least a dozen men moving about the property, some tending to livestock, others clearly serving as guards. Their weapons were visible and well-maintained, their posture alert and professional. A mountain of a man emerged from the barn as Sam approached, his massive frame making even the largest horses look like ponies. Jake Sullivan moved with the confident stride of someone who had never encountered an obstacle he couldn't overcome through strength, intelligence, or sheer force of will. His pale blue eyes fixed on Sam with the intensity of a hunting wolf, measuring, calculating, deciding whether the newcomer represented opportunity or threat. "Sam Mitchell," Jake's voice carried across the yard like distant thunder, "your reputation precedes you." Sam dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible, and his movements deliberate. Men like Sullivan didn't appreciate sudden gestures or signs of weakness. "Mr. Sullivan, I understand you might have work for someone with my background." Jake's smile was cold as winter wind. "Depends on whether your background includes the kind of flexibility my operations require. Tell me, Mitchell, what do you know about loyalty?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a burned bridge. Sam had been asked similar questions before by men who confused fear with loyalty, who demanded blind obedience in place of earned respect. His answers had varied depending on the circumstances, but something about Jake Sullivan demanded honesty, or at least the appearance of it. "I know that real loyalty can't be bought or beaten into a man," Sam replied carefully. "I know it has to be earned through mutual respect and fair dealing. And I know that a man who demands loyalty without offering it in return usually ends up with neither." Several of the nearby ranch hands had stopped their work to listen, their faces reflecting various degrees of surprise at Sam's boldness. No one spoke to Jake Sullivan that way, not if they valued their health and continued existence. But instead of anger, Jake's expression showed something that might have been approval. "Interesting perspective," Jake mused, beginning to walk toward the main house. "Most men who come looking for work here tell me exactly what they think I want to hear. Promises of absolute obedience, vows of eternal service, that sort of drivel." He glanced sideways at Sam. "But you're not most men, are you, Mitchell?" Sam fell into step beside the giant, noting how the other men on the ranch gave them a wide berth. "I found that honest men sleep better at night, even when honesty cost them opportunities. And what if I told you that the work I have in mind might conflict with that philosophy?" Jake asked as they climbed the steps to the main porch. "What if absolute obedience was exactly what I required?" "Then I'd thank you for your time and ride back to town," Sam answered without hesitation. "I've seen what happens to men who follow orders without thinking. Most of them end up dead or worse." Jake paused at the front door, his hand resting on the ornate brass handle. For a moment the air crackled with tension, as the two men sized each other up. Then Jake threw back his head and laughed, a sound like boulders tumbling down a mountainside. "I like you, Mitchell," he declared, pushing open the door. "Come inside, let's discuss terms." The interior of the Iron Crown house was as impressive as its exterior, with polished hardwood floors, imported furniture, and oil paintings that probably cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. But Sam's attention was immediately drawn to something else entirely. Sitting in a high-backed chair near the massive stone fireplace was a woman of extraordinary beauty, her dark hair pinned in an elaborate style, her dress made of silk that probably came from San Francisco or even Paris. "Allow me to introduce Miss Rose Carter," Jake said, his voice carrying a note of pride. "My houseguest and I hope eventual business partner." Rose stood gracefully, extending a gloved hand that Sam took briefly. Her grip was firm, her green eyes intelligent and assessing. There was something about her that didn't quite fit with the frontier setting, a refinement that spoke of education and culture far beyond what most women in the territory possessed. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying traces of an accent Sam couldn't quite place. "Jake has told me about your reputation. I understand you were quite the legend in certain circles." "Some circles," Sam acknowledged, "though I've been trying to leave that particular legend behind. And yet here you are," Rose observed with a knowing smile, "answering the call when opportunity presents itself." There was something in her tone that suggested she knew more about his circumstances than she should, but before Sam could pursue the thought, Jake gestured toward a leather sofa near the fireplace. "Sit," Jake commanded, his earlier friendliness replaced by businesslike efficiency. "We have matters to discuss, and I'm not a man who enjoys wasting time." Sam settled into the sofa, noting that it positioned him with his back partially to the door, a tactical disadvantage that Jake had undoubtedly arranged deliberately. Rose resumed her seat across from him, while Jake remained standing, using his impressive height to dominate the room. "What do you know about my operations here in Copper Ridge?" Jake asked without preamble. "Only what a man can learn from an evening in the saloon," Sam replied honestly. "You own most of the territory, you have the sheriff in your pocket, and people are afraid of you." Crude but essentially accurate, Jake nodded. "What the saloon gossips don't understand is the complexity of maintaining such an arrangement. Fear is a useful tool, but it's not sufficient by itself. A man in my position needs intelligence, planning, and occasionally the services of specialists." "What kind of specialists?" Sam asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Jake moved to an ornate sideboard, and poured himself a glass of whiskey from a crystal decanter. He didn't offer drinks to Sam or Rose, a subtle reminder of the hierarchy in the room. The kind who can handle delicate situations without leaving unnecessary complications. The kind who understand that sometimes problems need to disappear completely. The words confirmed Sam's suspicions about the nature of the work being offered. Jake Sullivan was looking for an assassin, someone to eliminate threats to his empire with professional efficiency. It wasn't the first time Sam had been approached for such services, and probably wouldn't be the last. "I see," Sam said carefully. "And what sort of problems are currently requiring such attention?" Jake's pale eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. "There's a federal marshal named Rose Carter, who's been asking uncomfortable questions about certain business practices in this territory. She's been operating undercover, posing as a potential investor, but my sources have confirmed her true identity." Sam's blood turned to ice in his veins as the implication of Jake's words sank in. He glanced at Rose, who was watching the exchange with calm detachment, apparently unconcerned that her cover had been blown, and her life was being casually discussed. "The irony, of course," Jake continued, taking a sip of his whiskey, "is that she's sitting right here in my parlor, drinking my coffee and enjoying my hospitality while planning to destroy everything I've built." Rose smiled serenely, as if Jake had just commented on the weather rather than revealed her identity as a federal agent. "Actually," she said in a voice now devoid of any accent, "the coffee is excellent, but I've been drinking tea, and I have to say your hospitality has been quite educational." Jake's laughter filled the room again, but this time there was no warmth in it. "I admire your composure, Marshal Carter. Most people in your situation would be showing considerably more concern for their immediate welfare. Most people in my situation aren't backed by the full authority of the federal government," Rose replied calmly. "I trust you received the telegram I had delivered this morning." For the first time since Sam had met him, Jake Sullivan's confident demeanor showed a crack. His eyes narrowed, and his grip on the whiskey glass tightened until Sam thought it might shatter. "What telegram?" Jake asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Rose reached into her reticule, and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which she handed to Sam rather than Jake. "Would you mind reading that aloud, Mr. Mitchell? I think it might be relevant to your employment considerations." Sam unfolded the telegram, with hands that trembled slightly, unsure whether he was about to read his own death warrant or something else entirely. The message was brief but devastating in its implications. Federal Marshal Rose Carter authorized to investigate allegations of human trafficking and corruption in Copper Ridge Territory. Stop additional agents en route. Stop any interference with federal investigation will result in immediate military intervention. Stop. Signed Deputy Attorney General Harrison Washington. Stop. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake's face had gone pale beneath his tan, and Sam could practically hear the man's mind racing as he calculated the implications of what he'd just heard. Human trafficking, military intervention. The federal government wasn't just interested in Jake Sullivan's empire, they were preparing to bring the full weight of federal law enforcement down on his head. "Of course," Rose continued conversationally, "the telegram doesn't mention that I've been gathering evidence for the past 6 months, or that I already have enough documentation to hang half the territorial government. It doesn't mention the 3 other agents currently operating in the area, or the company of cavalry that's been positioned just outside the territorial boundary. Jake set down his whiskey glass with elaborate care, his movements controlled but barely containing volcanic rage. You've been playing a very dangerous game, Marshal Carter. No more dangerous than the game you've been playing with women's lives, Rose replied, her composure finally cracking to reveal the steel beneath. Did you really think you could operate a trafficking ring for years without eventually attracting federal attention? Did you honestly believe that your bought sheriffs and corrupt officials would protect you forever? Sam felt the world tilting around him as the true scope of what he'd stumbled into became clear. This wasn't just about a powerful rancher maintaining control of his territory. This was about systematic criminal activity on a scale that demanded federal intervention. And somehow, he'd positioned himself directly in the middle of what was about to become a war. Mr. Mitchell, Rose said, turning her attention to him. I suspect you're beginning to understand that the employment opportunity Mr. Sullivan offered isn't quite what it appeared to be. The question now is whether you're the kind of man who walks away from this situation, or the kind who sees an opportunity to do something right for a change. Jake's hand had moved to rest on the grip of the pistol holstered at his hip, but he hadn't drawn the weapon yet. His pale eyes flicked between Sam and Rose, calculating odds, considering options, planning moves in a game that had suddenly become infinitely more complex. You're making assumptions about my character, Marshal, Sam said slowly. What makes you think I won't simply complete the job I came here to discuss? Rose studied his face with the intensity of someone whose life might depend on reading him correctly. Because 6 months ago in Tombstone, you walked away from a job that would have made you rich when you discovered your target was an innocent man. Because 3 years ago in Lincoln County, you switched sides in the middle of a range war when you realized you were fighting for the wrong people. Because everything I've learned about Sam Mitchell tells me you're not a killer for hire anymore, no matter how desperate your circumstances might be. The accuracy of her information was staggering. Rose Carter had obviously done her homework, researching not just Jake Sullivan's operation, but also the backgrounds of everyone who might become involved. Sam wondered how long she'd known he was coming to Copper Ridge, whether his arrival was coincidence or something more deliberate. Fascinating as this conversation has become, Jake interjected, his voice carrying an edge of barely controlled violence. It seems we've reached something of an impasse. Marshal Carter, you've revealed your hand rather dramatically. Mr. Mitchell, you've been presented with a choice between 2 very different forms of employment. Perhaps it's time for everyone to be completely honest about their intentions. Sam looked around the opulent room, taking in the expensive furnishings, the carefully arranged displays of wealth and power, the 2 people whose lives hung in the balance of his next words. Through the tall windows, he could see Jake's ranch hands going about their daily routine, unaware that their world was about to change forever. Before I make any decisions, Sam said finally, I think I need to understand exactly what we're talking about here. Marshal Carter mentioned human trafficking. That's a serious accusation to make against a man of Mr. Sullivan's standing in the community. Jake's smile was razor-sharp and twice as dangerous. Indeed it is. Perhaps the good Marshal would like to share some of her evidence with us. After all, if she's going to destroy my reputation, she might at least have the courtesy to explain her reasoning. Rose reached into her reticule again, this time withdrawing a small leather notebook. Very well. Let's start with the 23 women who have disappeared from this territory over the past 2 years. All young, all attractive, all either orphans or women whose absence wouldn't be immediately investigated. She flipped through several pages before continuing. Then there's the matter of the modified railroad cars that have been making regular stops at the Iron Crown siding, always at night, always heavily guarded. Cars that arrive empty and leave loaded with cargo that doesn't appear on any manifest. Jake's expression remained carefully neutral, but Sam noticed that his left eye had developed a slight twitch. Cattle shipments, Jake said smoothly. Special breeding stock bound for buyers in California and Oregon, nothing unusual about that. Cattle that require soundproofed cars, Rose asked innocently. Cattle that need to be fed meals appropriate for human consumption. Cattle that require chamber pots and feminine hygiene supplies. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an ornate grandfather clock in the corner. Sam felt sick as the implications of what Rose was describing sank in. This wasn't just criminal enterprise. This was an abomination that reduced human beings to livestock, that treated women as commodities to be bought and sold. "You're painting quite a picture, Marshal," Jake said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. "I hope you have more than circumstantial evidence to support such serious allegations." Rose smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Oh, I do. I have testimony from 3 women who escaped your operation. I have financial records showing payments to corrupt officials. I have photographs of your specialized railroad cars. And most importantly, I have a witness who's prepared to testify about the murder of a federal agent who got too close to your operation 2 years ago." Jake's hand moved reflexively toward his gun, then stopped as he apparently remembered that drawing on a federal marshal in the presence of a witness would only make his situation worse. "You're talking about Mary Sullivan, aren't you? My own sister." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Sam stared at Jake Sullivan, trying to reconcile the image of a man who would traffic in human misery with someone who had apparently lost his own sister to the investigation. "Mary wasn't just investigating your operation," Rose continued relentlessly. "She was working with federal agents to gather evidence. When you discovered her betrayal, you had her killed, and her body disposed of to make it look like she'd simply disappeared. You can't prove that." Jake snarled, his composure finally cracking completely. "Actually I can," Rose replied calmly. "Because the witness who's prepared to testify about Mary's murder is someone you trust completely. Someone who's been working with federal agents for months, feeding us information about your operation from the inside." Jake's face went white as the implication of her words sank in. Someone close to him, someone in his inner circle had been betraying him all along. His pale eyes swept the room as if seeing enemies in every shadow, suspicion replacing confidence as the foundation of his world crumbled beneath him. "Who?" he whispered, the single word carrying the weight of mountains. Rose's smile was triumphant now, the expression of someone who had played a long game and finally achieved checkmate. "Why don't you ask him yourself? Cole Brennan should be arriving any moment with the additional evidence we need to ensure your conviction." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the yard outside. Jake moved to the window with surprising speed for such a large man, his face twisting with rage as he confirmed Rose's claim. His most trusted foreman, the man who'd stood at his side for 5 years, was riding toward the house with a group of armed federal agents. "You magnificent bitch," Jake breathed, his voice filled with grudging admiration despite his fury. "You've been playing this game for months, haven't you? Setting up your pieces, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal your hand." 6 months actually, Rose corrected, "and I have to say it's been quite educational. Your operation is impressively organized, if utterly reprehensible." Jake turned from the window, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "The game isn't over yet, Marshal. You may have checkmated my operation, but you're still sitting in my house, surrounded by my men, with nowhere to run." "Actually," Sam said quietly, speaking for the first time in several minutes, "I think the Marshal has one more piece on the board." Both Jake and Rose turned to look at him, and Sam realized that the moment of truth had finally arrived. Everything that happened next would depend on the choice he made in the next few seconds, and that choice would define not just his immediate future but the kind of man he would be for the rest of his life. The sound of boots on the front porch announced that Cole Brennan and his federal escorts had arrived. In moments they would burst through the door, and whatever violence was going to erupt would begin in earnest. Sam Mitchell had perhaps 30 seconds to decide which side of this conflict he wanted to be on when the shooting started. He thought about the women Rose had described, victims of an operation that treated human beings as cargo. He thought about Mary Sullivan, a federal agent murdered for trying to bring justice to this remote corner of the territory. He thought about his own past, the choices that had brought him to this moment, the chance to finally do something that might balance the scales of his own conscience. The front door burst open with a crash that shook the entire house. Jake Sullivan stood motionless in the center of his crumbling empire, his pale eyes calculating odds that were diminishing by the second. The federal agents had positioned themselves strategically around the room, their weapons trained on him with professional precision. Through the tall windows, he could see more uniformed figures moving across his ranch, dismantling the operations he'd spent years building. The sound of distant shouting and the thunder of hooves filled the air as his world collapsed around him like a house of cards in a windstorm. Rebecca Morgan pressed her son closer against her skirts, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the giant of a man who had offered her security at the cost of her soul. Even surrounded and outnumbered, Jake Sullivan radiated a dangerous energy that made her skin crawl. She'd made her choice, rejected his proposal, but standing in this room filled with armed men and barely contained violence, she wondered if her principles would cost her son his mother. Tommy's small hand clutched at her dress, his young eyes wide with confusion and fear as he sensed the adult tension swirling around him. Rebecca smoothed his hair with trembling fingers, trying to project a calm she didn't feel while her mind raced through possible escape routes. The front door was blocked by federal agents, the windows were too high to reach safely with a child, and Jake Sullivan stood between her and any other exit like a mountain made of malice and muscle. Sam Mitchell watched the tableau unfold with the focused intensity of a man whose next decision might determine whether innocent people lived or died. His hand rested on the grip of his Colt, fingers positioned for the lightning-fast draw that had kept him alive through a dozen range wars and territorial disputes. But this wasn't a simple gunfight between professionals who understood the risks. This was a powder keg with civilians in the blast radius, and any wrong move could turn the elegant parlor into a slaughterhouse. Rose Carter stood with her back straight and her chin raised, the picture of federal authority despite the precarious situation. She'd spent months planning this moment, gathering evidence, positioning her pieces for the perfect capture of Jake Sullivan and his criminal organization. But plans rarely survived contact with reality, and the presence of Rebecca Morgan and her child had introduced variables that threatened to unravel everything she'd worked to achieve. "You know," Jake said conversationally, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk, "I have to admire the scope of what you've accomplished here, Marshal Carter. The coordination, the timing, the sheer audacity of infiltrating my organization from multiple angles simultaneously. It's quite impressive work." Rose's green eyes never wavered from his face. "Thank you for the professional courtesy, but flattery won't change the outcome here. You're finished, Sullivan. Your trafficking operation is shut down, your associates are under arrest, and you're going to spend the rest of your life in a federal prison." Jake's laugh rumbled through the room like distant thunder. "Prison assumes I allow myself to be taken alive, Marshal, and given the alternative forms of justice available in this territory, death might be preferable to whatever fate awaits me in your federal courts." The casual mention of death sent a chill through Rebecca's bones. She'd heard stories about Jake Sullivan's reputation, whispered tales of men who crossed him and simply disappeared, but she'd never imagined herself caught in the middle of such violence. Her grip on Tommy tightened as she considered the terrible irony that her attempt to protect her son might have placed him in even greater danger. Cole Brennan shifted position slightly, his weathered face showing the strain of betraying a man he'd served loyally for 5 years. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Jake. Come quietly, and maybe we can work out something that doesn't end with bloodshed." "Something like what?" Jake asked, his pale eyes fixing on his former foreman with laser intensity. "A plea bargain. Cooperation in exchange for leniency. The chance to spend my remaining years in a cell instead of a grave. The chance to do one decent thing with your life," Cole replied firmly. "Tell us where the remaining women are being held. Give us the information we need to shut down the rest of your network. Save some lives for a change instead of destroying them." Jake's expression shifted, something almost like pain flickering across his granite features. "You think this was easy for me, Cole? You think I enjoyed what we had to do to build this empire? Every choice I made, every compromise I accepted, was necessary for survival in a world that gives men like me only 2 options, be the predator, or become the prey." "That's bullshit and you know it," Sam interjected, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "I've met plenty of men who used that same excuse to justify their crimes. The truth is, you chose this path because it was profitable, not because it was necessary." Jake's attention shifted to Sam with the intensity of a hunting wolf scenting fresh prey. "Interesting perspective from a man who's made his living with a gun. How many men have you killed, Mitchell? How many lives have you ended in service to causes you probably didn't fully understand?" The question hit Sam like a physical blow, dragging up memories he'd spent years trying to bury. Faces of men he'd killed flashed through his mind like playing cards in a riffle shuffle, each one accompanied by the circumstances that had led to violence. Some had been criminals who deserved their fate, others had simply been on the wrong side of conflicts that history would judge as pointless and destructive. "The difference," Sam said slowly, "is that I never told myself I was doing good while I pulled the trigger. I knew exactly what I was, and I've spent the last few years trying to become something better. And yet here you are," Jake observed, once again in a room full of armed men, once again preparing to solve problems with violence. "Some patterns are too deeply ingrained to break, don't you think?" Rebecca watched this exchange with growing horror as she realized that the 2 men were circling each other like wolves, their words serving as preliminary skirmishes before the inevitable explosion of gunfire. Her son's life hung in the balance of their philosophical disagreement, and she found herself hating them both for their willingness to risk innocent lives in pursuit of their own agendas. "Stop it," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the tension crackling through the room. "Just stop it, both of you." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Every eye in the room turned toward Rebecca, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical pressure against her chest. But having spoken, she found she couldn't stop, the words pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. "You want to know about choices?" she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'll tell you about choices. I chose to trust my husband when he said he could make our farm profitable. I chose to believe the bank when they promised reasonable terms on our loan. I chose to have faith that hard work and honest living would be enough to build a decent life for my family." Her eyes swept the room, taking in the federal agents, the criminal mastermind, the gunfighter with his hand on his weapon. "And where did those choices lead me? To standing in this room, listening to men argue about violence while my son's future hangs in the balance. So forgive me if I'm not impressed by your philosophical debates about predators and prey." Jake Sullivan studied Rebecca with newfound respect, his pale eyes reflecting something that might have been genuine admiration. "You have spirit, Mrs. Morgan. I can see why your husband fell in love with you, and why he was willing to take such desperate risks to provide for your family." "Don't," Rebecca said firmly, "don't you dare try to use my husband's memory to justify whatever twisted game you're playing here." "No game," Jake replied seriously, "just recognition of a kindred spirit. You see, Mrs. Morgan, we're not so different, you and I. We've both made difficult choices in impossible circumstances. The only difference is the scale of our respective operations." Rose Carter's voice cut through the moment like a knife through butter. "The only similarity between you and Mrs. Morgan is that you've both been shaped by desperate circumstances. The difference is that she chose to maintain her integrity while you chose to abandon yours." Jake's attention shifted back to the federal marshal, his expression hardening once again. "Integrity is a luxury that men in my position can't afford, Marshal Carter. When you're responsible for an operation of this scope, when you have hundreds of people depending on you for their livelihoods, moral purity becomes secondary to practical results." "Hundreds of people," Cole Brennan said bitterly. "Is that what you call the women you've trafficked? Is that how you justify turning human beings into commodities?" "I call them what they were before I provided them with opportunities," Jake replied coldly. "Desperate women with no prospects, no family support, no legal protection in a world that views them as disposable. I gave them purpose, direction, a chance to serve something larger than themselves." The rationalization was so breathtakingly callous that it left the room in stunned silence. Sam felt his finger tighten on the trigger of his still holstered weapon, his professional restraint warring with a desire to end this conversation with decisive violence. Rose Carter's face had gone pale with rage, her hands clenched into fists as she struggled to maintain her official composure. But it was Rebecca Morgan who broke the silence, her voice carrying a fury that made even Jake Sullivan take a step backward. "Purpose," she repeated, her tone dripping with disgust. "You call enslaving women purpose? You call destroying lives opportunity? Those women had names, Mr. Sullivan. They had dreams and hopes and people who loved them. They weren't commodities to be bought and sold like cattle at auction." Jake's expression shifted again, something almost like pain flickering across his granite features. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't remember every face, every name, every story? But this world doesn't offer clean choices to people like us, Mrs. Morgan. Sometimes survival requires accepting compromises that more fortunate people would never understand." "No," Rebecca said firmly, "survival requires maintaining your humanity even when circumstances make it difficult. The moment you start treating other people as objects to be used for your benefit, you've lost everything that makes life worth living." The philosophical exchange was interrupted by the sound of heavy boots on the front porch, followed by the appearance of another federal agent in the doorway. The newcomer's uniform was dusty from hard riding, and his expression carried the urgency of someone bearing important news. "Marshal Carter," the agent called out, slightly breathless from exertion. "We've secured 3 of the holding facilities, 17 women recovered alive, all in need of medical attention but stable. We've also found evidence of at least 12 more victims who didn't survive the trafficking process." The numbers hit the room like hammer blows. 17 survivors, 12 dead. The stark mathematics of Jake Sullivan's operation reduced to cold statistics that couldn't begin to capture the human cost of his criminal enterprise. Rose Carter's face showed a mixture of relief and rage as she processed the information. "What about the other locations?" she asked tersely. "We know there are at least 2 more facilities based on the financial records." The agent glanced nervously at Jake Sullivan before responding. "That's the problem, Marshal. The facilities we found were abandoned except for the women who were too sick or injured to move. It looks like someone gave orders to evacuate the other locations and destroy any evidence." Jake's smile was cold and triumphant. "Insurance policies, Marshal Carter. A wise businessman always prepares for contingencies, even ones involving federal intervention." Rose's composure finally cracked completely. "Where are they, you bastard? Where are the other women?" "That information has value," Jake replied calmly. "Perhaps we should discuss what you're willing to offer in exchange for it." The standoff had reached its breaking point. Federal agents surrounded a criminal mastermind who still held innocent lives as bargaining chips. A desperate mother clutched her child while armed men debated the mathematics of violence and justice. And in the center of it all, Sam Mitchell found himself facing the same choice that had defined his entire adult life, whether to solve problems with his gun or find another way forward. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 3 o'clock, its melodious tones seeming absurdly civilized in the context of the deadly confrontation. Through the tall windows, Sam could see cavalry soldiers moving across the ranch yard with military precision, securing buildings and rounding up Jake's remaining men. The operation was proceeding exactly as Rose Carter had planned, except for the crucial detail that the mastermind himself remained free and dangerous. Tommy Morgan chose that moment to peek out from behind his mother's skirts, his young eyes wide with curiosity as he studied the giant man who dominated the room with his presence. Children, Sam reflected, had an uncanny ability to see through adult pretenses to the essential truth beneath. What did this innocent boy see when he looked at Jake Sullivan? "Are you a real cowboy?" Tommy asked suddenly, his piping voice cutting through the adult tension like sunlight through storm clouds. The question seemed to catch Jake off guard, his predatory intensity faltering in the face of childish innocence. For a moment his expression softened, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been under different circumstances. "I suppose I am," Jake replied gently, his voice losing its harsh edge as he addressed the boy. "Do you like cowboys, son?" Tommy nodded eagerly, apparently unaware that he was conversing with one of the most dangerous men in the territory. "My papa used to tell me stories about cowboys who fought bad men and protected people. Are you one of the good cowboys or the bad cowboys?" The innocent question hung in the air like a challenge to everyone in the room. Rebecca's face showed a mixture of pride and terror as her son's natural curiosity led him into dangerous conversational territory. The federal agents exchanged glances, unsure whether to be amused or horrified by the child's directness. Jake Sullivan stared down at the boy for a long moment, his pale eyes reflecting depths of emotion that Sam hadn't expected to see. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of regret that seemed to surprise even him. "I used to think I was one of the good ones," Jake admitted quietly, "but I'm afraid the answer to your question is more complicated than your papa's stories probably suggested." "Why?" Tommy persisted with the relentless logic of childhood. "Can't you just choose to be good?" The simplicity of the question seemed to physically stagger Jake Sullivan. He took a step backward, his massive frame swaying slightly as if the words of a 4-year-old had struck him with more force than any physical blow. For the first time since Sam had met him, the giant of Copper Ridge looked uncertain, vulnerable, almost human. "Sometimes," Jake said slowly, "men make choices that take them so far down dark paths that finding their way back to the light becomes impossible. Sometimes the things you do to survive change you into someone you don't recognize anymore." Rebecca watched this exchange with growing amazement. Her son's innocent questions were accomplishing something that federal marshals and armed agents had failed to achieve. They were cracking the shell of rationalization and self-justification that Jake Sullivan had built around his crimes. The monster was remembering what it felt like to be human. Rose Carter seized the moment with the instincts of a seasoned investigator. "It's not too late, Sullivan. You can still choose to do the right thing. Tell us where the remaining women are being held. Help us save lives instead of destroying them." Jake's attention shifted between the federal marshal and the innocent boy who had asked the most important question of all. The battle playing out across his features was visible to everyone in the room. the pragmatic criminal who had built an empire on human suffering, warring with whatever remnants of conscience still existed beneath years of moral compromise. The remaining facilities, Jake said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, are located at the old mining camp, 15 miles north of Devil's Canyon, and at a ranch house near Crystal Falls. But you need to move quickly. My associates have orders to eliminate all evidence if they don't receive specific signals from me by sunset. The admission seemed to drain something vital from Jake's massive frame. He swayed slightly, as if the weight of his confession had physically weakened him. Rose Carter immediately began barking orders to the federal agents, coordinating the rescue operations that would hopefully save the remaining victims of Jake's trafficking network. But Sam Mitchell found himself watching Jake Sullivan with something approaching sympathy. The man was a criminal, a monster who had destroyed countless lives in pursuit of profit and power. But he was also a human being who had somehow found his way back from the moral abyss, even if only for a moment. The transformation was remarkable and deeply troubling in its implications. Why? Sam asked quietly, his voice intended only for Jake's ears. Why tell them now? You could have taken that information to your grave. Jake's pale eyes met Sam's with an expression of infinite weariness. Because a 4-year-old boy asked me if I was a good cowboy or a bad cowboy. And for the first time in years I remembered what it felt like to want to be good. The federal agents were already moving, racing against time to reach the remaining facilities before Jake's associates could eliminate the evidence and the witnesses. Rose Carter coordinated the operation with professional efficiency, her earlier emotional outbursts replaced by focused determination. The cavalry soldiers visible through the windows were mounting up for hard rides to remote locations where innocent lives hung in the balance. Rebecca Morgan gathered her son closer, finally beginning to believe that the nightmare might be ending without violence. Tommy seemed blissfully unaware of the role his innocent questions had played in potentially saving lives, his attention already shifting to other aspects of the grand adventure he was witnessing. Cole Brennan approached his former boss with something like pity in his weathered features. "Jake," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I never enjoyed betraying you, but what we were doing, it had to stop." Jake nodded slowly, his massive shoulders sagging with the weight of accumulated guilt and exhaustion. "I know, Cole. I probably would have done the same thing in your position. Maybe I should have done it years ago myself." The admission of regret seemed to complete Jake Sullivan's transformation from criminal mastermind to broken man. He offered no resistance as federal agents moved to place him in restraints, his earlier defiance replaced by resignation and something that might have been relief. The empire he'd built through violence and corruption was crumbling around him, but for the first time in years he seemed at peace with himself. Sam Mitchell holstered his weapon, the crisis apparently resolved without the violence he'd been preparing for. But as he watched Jake Sullivan being led away in chains, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real story was more complex than simple justice prevailing over evil. The giant of Copper Ridge was a criminal who deserved punishment for his crimes, but he was also a cautionary tale about how good intentions could be corrupted by desperate circumstances and moral compromise. As the federal agents began the process of documenting evidence and coordinating the rescue operations, Rebecca Morgan approached Sam with her son still clutched protectively against her side. Her face showed a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty as she struggled to process everything that had happened. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice carrying depths of emotion that simple words couldn't fully express. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Sam studied this remarkable woman who had faced impossible choices with such courage and integrity. "I think you would have found a way to protect your son regardless. You're stronger than you know, Mrs. Morgan." Rebecca's smile was tired but genuine. "I hope you're right, because now I have to figure out how to build a new life with no money, no home, and a 4-year-old who thinks today's adventure was the most exciting thing that ever happened to him." The practical concerns of her situation were daunting, but Sam found himself wanting to help this woman who had impressed him with her moral courage. "Actually," he said carefully, "I might have some suggestions about that, if you're interested in hearing them." Before Rebecca could respond, Rose Carter approached them with a federal agent's badge in one hand and an official-looking document in the other. Her expression was serious but not unfriendly as she addressed the small group. "Miss Morgan," she said formally, "on behalf of the federal government I want to thank you for your cooperation in this investigation.
Your courage in refusing Sullivan's proposals helped us establish important evidence about his methods and motivations.
Rebecca looked confused. I didn't cooperate with any investigation. I didn't even know there was an investigation until I walked into this room. Sometimes, Rose explained with a slight smile, the most important cooperation comes from people who simply refuse to compromise their principles when offered incentives to do so. Your rejection of Sullivan's marriage proposal demonstrated that he was attempting to use coercion and extortion to force compliance, which strengthens our case considerably. The explanation seemed to satisfy Rebecca's confusion, but Sam noticed that Rose Carter was studying him with speculative intensity. The federal marshal clearly had something else on her mind, and he suspected it involved his own future prospects. Mr. Mitchell, Rose said finally, I wonder if I might have a word with you privately. There are some matters we should discuss regarding your potential testimony in the upcoming trials. Sam nodded, understanding that this conversation would likely determine whether he faced charges for his own past activities or received consideration for his cooperation in bringing down Jake Sullivan's operation. The irony wasn't lost on him that his attempt to find honest work in Copper Ridge had led him back into the world of federal law enforcement, albeit from a very different perspective than his previous experiences. As the various participants in the day's drama began to disperse for their separate purposes, Sam took a final look around Jake Sullivan's opulent parlor. The expensive furnishings and imported luxuries remained unchanged, but the atmosphere had been fundamentally altered by the events that had unfolded within these walls. The empire built on human suffering was ending, and with it, a chapter in the violent history of the Colorado Territory. Outside, the cavalry soldiers were completing their security sweep of the ranch, while federal agents prepared for the difficult task of gathering evidence and coordinating rescues at remote locations. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber that seemed almost peaceful after the tensions of the confrontation. But Sam Mitchell knew that the real work was just beginning. Trials would need to be conducted, evidence would need to be presented, and the complex web of corruption that had enabled Jake Sullivan's operation would need to be unraveled thread by thread. Justice, he reflected, was often more complicated and time-consuming than the simple resolution of immediate conflicts. As he prepared to follow Rose Carter for their private discussion, Sam caught sight of Rebecca Morgan helping her son into a federal agent's wagon for transport back to town. The woman who had faced down a criminal mastermind with nothing but moral courage was beginning the next chapter of her life with characteristic determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead for her, Sam suspected she would meet them with the same integrity that had impressed him so deeply. The giant of Copper Ridge was gone, his empire dismantled, his victims on their way to freedom or justice, but the story of what happened next would be written by the survivors, the witnesses, and the ordinary people who had chosen courage over comfort when the moment demanded action. In that choice, Sam thought, lay the real victory of the day. 6 months after the fall of Jake Sullivan's empire, the morning sun rose over a transformed Copper Ridge with the golden promise of new beginnings. Rebecca Morgan stood on the front porch of her modest but comfortable home, watching her son Tommy chase chickens around the yard with the boundless energy of childhood. The little house wasn't much to look at compared to the grandeur of the Iron Crown Ranch, but it was theirs, purchased with the reward money the federal government had provided for her testimony against Sullivan's organization. The trials had been long and difficult, requiring Rebecca to relive the terrifying moments when she'd faced the giant of a man who had wanted to make her his queen through coercion and intimidation. But justice had prevailed in the end, with Jake Sullivan sentenced to life imprisonment for his crimes against humanity. The man who had once dominated the territory through fear and violence would spend his remaining years in a federal penitentiary, finally paying for the lives he'd destroyed in pursuit of his twisted empire. Sam Mitchell emerged from the barn, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his face showing the honest weariness of hard physical labor. The former gunfighter had found his calling as a rancher and deputy federal marshal, splitting his time between managing the small spread he'd purchased adjacent to Rebecca's property and investigating territorial crimes for Rose Carter's expanded federal task force. The work was challenging but rewarding, offering him the chance to build something positive rather than simply tearing down what others had created. "Morning," Sam called out, tipping his hat to Rebecca as he crossed the yard toward her porch. "Tommy's up early today." Rebecca smiled, her face showing the contentment of a woman who had found peace after enduring tremendous hardship. "He's excited about the school picnic this afternoon. Mrs. Patterson promised to teach the children how to make corn dollies, and Tommy's been talking about it for days." The transformation in Rebecca Morgan over the past 6 months had been remarkable to witness. The desperate woman who had once contemplated a marriage of convenience to save her son's future had blossomed into a confident community leader, serving on the school board and organizing charitable efforts for other struggling families. Her natural intelligence and moral courage had found proper outlets in legitimate endeavors, earning her the respect and admiration of everyone in Copper Ridge. Speaking of the picnic, Sam said, settling onto the porch steps with the easy familiarity of a frequent visitor, "I was hoping you might save me a dance at the evening social, that is, if you don't have any other commitments." Rebecca's cheeks flushed pink, but her eyes sparkled with genuine pleasure at the invitation. The relationship between her and Sam had developed slowly and carefully, built on mutual respect and shared experiences rather than desperate circumstances. Both had been scarred by their past trials, but they'd found healing in each other's company, and in the quiet rhythms of building new lives together. "I think I might be able to accommodate that request," Rebecca replied with mock formality that dissolved into laughter. "Though I should warn you that my dancing skills are somewhat rusty. It's been years since I had occasion to practice." Sam's smile was warm and genuine, transforming his weathered features into something approaching handsome. "Well, I'm not exactly known for my grace on the dance floor either. We'll probably step on each other's feet and provide entertainment for the whole town." The easy banter between them was interrupted by the sound of approaching hooves. A lone rider crested the hill overlooking their small valley, moving at the steady pace of someone on official business rather than the urgent gallop of emergency. As the figure drew closer, Rebecca recognized the distinctive silhouette of Rose Carter, now the chief federal marshal for the Colorado Territory, and one of the most respected law enforcement officers in the region. Rose dismounted with practiced ease, her badge glinting in the morning sunlight as she approached the porch. The past 6 months had been kind to her as well, with her success in dismantling Sullivan's trafficking network earning her recognition and promotion within the Federal Marshal Service. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had proven herself in the most challenging circumstances, and emerged victorious. "Good morning, you two," Rose called out cheerfully. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just planning our strategy for embarrassing ourselves at tonight's dance," Sam replied with a grin. "What brings you out this way, Marshal Carter? Not more trouble, I hope." Rose's expression grew serious as she climbed the porch steps, her official demeanor replacing the friendly casualness of her greeting. "Actually, I have some news that I thought you should hear directly from me. It concerns Jake Sullivan." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine at the mention of that name. Despite the passage of time and the security of her new life, the memory of the giant man who had threatened her family still had the power to disturb her peace of mind. She unconsciously moved closer to Sam, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "What about him?" Sam asked, his own expression growing alert and focused. "He's supposed to be locked up for life in that federal prison in Kansas." Rose nodded grimly. "He is, and he's going to stay there. But that's not what I came to discuss. You see, during his imprisonment, Sullivan has been writing letters, hundreds of them actually, addressed to various people throughout the territory. The prison officials have been monitoring his correspondence, as they do with all high-profile inmates." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts before continuing. "Most of the letters have been rambling philosophical treatises about guilt, redemption, and the choices that define a man's character. But there's one letter in particular that I thought you should know about, Rebecca." Rebecca's heart began to race as she anticipated what Rose might reveal. "A letter to me?" "No," Rose replied gently. "A letter about you. Sullivan has been writing to various federal officials, detailing his crimes and providing information about other criminal networks he was aware of during his operations. But in several of these letters, he specifically mentions the day you rejected his marriage proposal." The memory of that terrifying confrontation came flooding back with vivid clarity. Rebecca could still see Jake Sullivan's pale blue eyes, still hear his voice offering her security in exchange for her freedom. The courage that had enabled her to refuse his offer now seemed almost impossible to believe, as if it had belonged to someone else entirely. "What does he say about it?" Rebecca asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to know the answer. Rose reached into her coat and withdrew a folded document. "This is a copy of one of his letters to the Attorney General. With your permission, I'd like to read the relevant section." Rebecca nodded, steeling herself for whatever revelation was coming. Sam moved closer, his presence providing the strength she needed to face this unexpected connection to her past. Rose unfolded the letter and began to read in a clear, professional voice. "I have spent considerable time reflecting on the choices that led to my current circumstances, and I find myself returning repeatedly to a moment that crystallized the fundamental nature of human character. Mrs. Rebecca Morgan, a widow facing destitution, was offered security and comfort in exchange for her compliance with my wishes. Her rejection of this proposal, made while holding her young son and surrounded by armed men, represented a moral courage that I had forgotten could exist. The marshal paused, glancing up at Rebecca before continuing. Sullivan goes on to write, "In that moment Mrs. Morgan demonstrated that true strength lies not in the power to dominate others, but in the refusal to be dominated regardless of consequences. Her choice reminded me of the man I had once hoped to become, before fear and ambition corrupted my judgment. If there is any legacy I wish to leave from my crimes, it is the recognition that ordinary people like Mrs. Morgan possess extraordinary courage when faced with impossible choices." The silence that followed Rose's reading was profound and emotionally charged. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she processed the unexpected acknowledgement from the man who had once threatened everything she held dear. That Jake Sullivan, even from his prison cell, had recognized and honored her moment of moral courage seemed almost impossible to believe. "There's more," Rose continued gently. "Sullivan has also established a trust fund using assets recovered from his criminal enterprise. The fund is designed to provide assistance to families facing financial hardship, particularly women with children who find themselves in desperate circumstances. He specifically requested that you oversee the administration of this fund, if you're willing to accept the responsibility." Rebecca stared at Rose in amazement. "He wants me to manage his money, to help other families facing the same situation I was in." "Exactly," Rose confirmed. "It's a substantial sum, enough to make a real difference in many lives. The federal government has verified that the funds come from legitimate asset forfeitures rather than criminal proceeds, so there are no legal impediments to the arrangement." Sam whistled softly, clearly impressed by the unexpected turn of events. "That's quite a gesture from a man who tried to force you into marriage. What changed his mind, do you think?" "Tommy," Rebecca said quietly, the answer coming to her with sudden clarity. "It was when Tommy asked him if he was a good cowboy or a bad cowboy. Something about that innocent question broke through all his justifications and reminded him of who he used to be." Rose nodded in agreement. "Sullivan mentions that conversation in several of his letters. He writes about how your son's question forced him to confront the reality of what he had become, and how your example showed him that redemption was still possible, even for someone who had fallen as far as he had." The irony of the situation was not lost on any of them. The man who had once represented the greatest threat to Rebecca's family, was now offering her the means to help other families facing similar challenges. It was as if Jake Sullivan was attempting to transform his legacy from one of destruction to one of healing, using the very woman he had tried to control as his instrument of redemption. "I'll need time to think about this," Rebecca said finally. "Managing that kind of responsibility, it's not something to be taken lightly." "Of course," Rose agreed. "There's no pressure to decide immediately. But I will say that the federal government believes you're uniquely qualified for this role. Your experience with financial hardship, combined with your demonstrated integrity and judgment, makes you an ideal candidate to ensure the funds are used appropriately." Tommy came running around the corner of the house at that moment, his face flushed with excitement, and his clothes covered in dirt from his adventures in the yard. He skidded to a stop when he saw the adults engaged in serious conversation, his natural exuberance temporarily subdued by their solemn expressions. "Mama," he said tentatively, "is everything all right? You look sad." Rebecca gathered her son into her arms, holding him close as she considered how to explain the complex emotions swirling through her heart. How could she tell a 4-year-old that the man who had once frightened them both was now trying to make amends for his crimes by helping other families in need? "Everything's fine, sweetheart," she said gently. "Marshall Carter was just telling us about some important work that might help other children whose families are having difficulties." Tommy's face brightened immediately. "Like when Papa was sick and we didn't have enough money for medicine, could we help families like that?" The innocent simplicity of his question cut straight to the heart of the matter. This wasn't about Jake Sullivan's attempt at redemption, or the complex moral implications of using criminal proceeds for charitable purposes. This was about helping children like Tommy, whose families faced impossible choices between basic necessities. "Yes," Rebecca said, her decision crystallizing with sudden certainty. "Exactly like that." She looked up at Rose with new determination in her eyes. "I'll do it. I'll manage the fund and make sure it goes to families who truly need help. But I have conditions." Rose smiled, apparently unsurprised by Rebecca's acceptance. "I'm listening."
First, I want complete autonomy in making funding decisions. No interference from federal bureaucrats or well-meaning officials who don't understand what it's like to choose between heating your home and feeding your children. Agreed, Rose nodded. Second, I want the fund's existence to be known throughout the territory. Families in need shouldn't have to suffer in silence because they don't know help is available. Also agreed. And third, Rebecca continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, I want it made clear that this assistance comes with no strings attached, no political requirements, no religious obligations, no expectations of gratitude or subservience, just help when it's needed most. Rose extended her hand with a smile of genuine admiration. Mrs. Morgan, I think Jake Sullivan chose his administrator very wisely. The federal government accepts all your conditions. As they shook hands sealing the agreement that would define the next chapter of Rebecca's life, Sam felt a surge of pride and affection for this remarkable woman. She had faced down a criminal mastermind with nothing but moral courage, survived months of legal proceedings with grace and dignity, and now was transforming her traumatic experience into an opportunity to help others facing similar challenges. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, burning off the last wisps of mist from the valley, and revealing the landscape in all its stark beauty. The mountains stood like silent sentinels on the horizon, their snow-capped peaks gleaming white against the deep blue sky. It was the kind of day that made a person grateful to be alive, grateful for second chances and unexpected opportunities. Well, Rose said, gathering her papers and preparing to leave, I should let you get back to your preparations for the school picnic. But before I go, there's one more thing you should know. She paused dramatically, clearly enjoying the suspense she was creating. The territorial government has approved the incorporation of Copper Ridge as an official town, complete with elected officials and municipal services. They're looking for candidates for mayor in the upcoming election. Rebecca's eyes widened in surprise. Mayor? I hadn't heard anything about that. The position requires someone with demonstrated leadership abilities, unquestioned integrity, and the respect of the community. Rose continued with a meaningful look. Your name has been mentioned by several prominent citizens as the ideal candidate. Sam chuckled at Rebecca's shocked expression. You know, Mayor Morgan has a nice ring to it. Though I suspect the job comes with its own set of challenges. I couldn't possibly, Rebecca protested. I have no experience with municipal government, no understanding of budgets and regulations, and all the complexities involved in running a town. You managed to stand up to Jake Sullivan when he tried to force you into marriage, Rose pointed out. You've organized relief efforts for struggling families, served on the school board, and now you're taking on the administration of a charitable fund. I'd say you have more relevant experience than most candidates for small-town mayor. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Rebecca had never imagined herself in a position of such responsibility, but the challenges of municipal leadership seemed manageable compared to what she'd already survived. And the opportunity to shape the future of Copper Ridge, to ensure it became the kind of community where families could thrive, was incredibly appealing. Think about it, Rose encouraged as she mounted her horse. The filing deadline isn't for another month, so you have time to make a decision. But I will say this, Copper Ridge needs leaders who understand that true strength comes from service to others, not from dominating them. As Rose rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a wealth of possibilities in her wake, Rebecca found herself contemplating a future she had never dared to imagine. From a desperate widow facing destitution to a potential mayor and administrator of a charitable fund, her life had been transformed in ways that defied all logical expectation. You're thinking about it, aren't you? Sam observed with a knowing smile. The mayor's position, I mean. Rebecca nodded slowly, her mind racing through the implications and possibilities. It's crazy, isn't it? 6 months ago I was ready to accept marriage to a criminal just to keep a roof over Tommy's head. Now I'm being asked to run for mayor and manage a fund that could help hundreds of families. Not crazy, Sam corrected gently. Appropriate. You've always had the qualities of a leader, Rebecca. You just needed the opportunity to develop them. Tommy tugged at his mother's skirt, demanding attention with the impatience of childhood. Mama, what's a mayor? And why is everyone talking about you becoming one? Rebecca knelt down to meet her son at eye level, choosing her words carefully. A mayor is someone who helps make decisions for the whole town, sweetie. They try to make sure everyone has what they need to be safe and happy, like making sure all the children have food and warm clothes. Tommy asked with the directness that had somehow changed Jake Sullivan's heart. Exactly like that, Rebecca confirmed, feeling her decision solidify with each word. Would you like it if Mama became the mayor and tried to help all the families in Copper Ridge? Tommy's face lit up with enthusiasm. Yes, and then you could make sure no other children have to be scared like we were when Papa was sick. The innocent wisdom of her son's response settled the matter once and for all. Rebecca Morgan would run for mayor of Copper Ridge, not because she sought power or prestige, but because she understood what it meant to face impossible choices, and had learned that true leadership meant serving others rather than oneself. Sam watched this exchange with growing affection and admiration for both mother and son. The woman who had impressed him with her courage in the face of overwhelming odds, was now embracing a future filled with new challenges and opportunities, and the little boy whose innocent questions had transformed a criminal's heart, was growing up with an understanding of justice and compassion that would serve him well in the years to come. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when the school picnic commenced in the meadow behind the newly constructed schoolhouse. Families from throughout the area gathered with baskets of food and hearts full of hope for the future. Children ran through the grass with wild abandon, their laughter echoing across the valley like music from heaven itself. Rebecca stood near the dessert table, watching Tommy participate in a three-legged race with his best friend from school. The sight of her son's uninhibited joy filled her with gratitude for the path that had led them to this moment. The journey had been difficult and frightening, but it had ultimately brought them to a place of safety and belonging. Mrs. Morgan, a hesitant voice interrupted her reverie. Rebecca turned to see a young woman she didn't recognize, probably in her early 20s, holding the hand of a small girl who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. Yes, Rebecca replied warmly, noting the woman's worn clothes and the anxious expression that spoke of financial hardship. I'm Sarah Fletcher, the woman said nervously. This is my daughter Emma. We just arrived in Copper Ridge yesterday, and someone in town told me I should speak with you about help for families in need. Rebecca's heart went out to this young mother who was clearly struggling to provide for her child. The resemblance to her own situation just months earlier was unmistakable, and she felt a surge of determination to ensure that Sarah Fletcher wouldn't face the same impossible choices that had once confronted her. Of course, Rebecca said gently, why don't we find somewhere quiet to talk? I think there might be some options available that could help your family get established here in Copper Ridge. As she led Sarah and Emma toward a secluded area near the edge of the meadow, Rebecca reflected on the strange circularity of her life. The woman who had once been offered help in exchange for her freedom, was now in a position to offer help without conditions or expectations. The transformation was both humbling and empowering, a reminder that even the darkest circumstances could lead to unexpected opportunities for service and redemption. The evening social began as the sun touched the tops of the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. A small band of local musicians provided entertainment while couples moved through the simple dance steps that had been popular in the territory for decades. The atmosphere was festive and hopeful, reflecting the community's growing confidence in its future. Sam Mitchell stood at the edge of the makeshift dance floor, watching Rebecca move gracefully through a country waltz with Doc Henderson, who had gallantly offered to be her first partner of the evening. The transformation in her appearance was remarkable, from the simple but elegant dress she wore to the confident smile that lit up her face. This was not the same desperate woman who had once contemplated a marriage of convenience to save her family. When the music ended, Sam made his way across the dance floor with determined purpose. I believe you promised me a dance, Mrs. Morgan, he said with a formal bow that drew laughter from nearby couples. Indeed I did, Mr. Mitchell, Rebecca replied with equal formality, accepting his offered hand with a curtsy that would have done justice to a grand ballroom. As they moved together through the steps of a simple country dance, Sam found himself marveling at the series of events that had brought them to this moment. A year ago he had been a drifter looking for honest work, and a chance to leave his violent past behind. Now he was a respected member of the community, a deputy federal marshal, and a man contemplating a future filled with possibilities he had never dared to imagine. Rebecca, he said quietly as the music swirled around them, there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you. Oh, she replied, her eyes sparkling with curiosity, and perhaps a hint of anticipation. It's about the future, Sam continued, suddenly finding himself more nervous than he'd been facing down armed criminals. About what we might build together, if you're interested in such possibilities." Rebecca's smile was radiant as she understood the deeper meaning behind his carefully chosen words. "I think I might be very interested in discussing such possibilities, Mr. Mitchell. Perhaps we could arrange a time for a more detailed conversation." "I'd like that very much," Sam replied, feeling as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. As the evening progressed and the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, the people of Copper Ridge celebrated not just the simple pleasures of music and dancing, but the larger triumph of community over adversity, of hope over despair, of ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded courage. Tommy Morgan fell asleep in his mother's arms as the festivities wound down, his small face peaceful and content in the security of her embrace. Rebecca looked down at her son, and then across the meadow at the friends and neighbors who had become their extended family, and she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this place of belonging. The giant of Copper Ridge was gone, his empire of fear and exploitation replaced by a community built on mutual support and shared values, and in his place had risen something far more powerful and enduring: the quiet strength of ordinary people who had chosen to care for one another, to build rather than destroy, to offer hope rather than despair. As Sam helped Rebecca and Tommy into their wagon for the ride home, she caught sight of a shooting star streaking across the dark sky. She closed her eyes and made a wish, not for herself but for all the families who were still facing impossible choices, still struggling to survive in a world that often seemed indifferent to their suffering. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. There would be a mayoral campaign to consider, a charitable fund to establish, and countless families to help. But tonight, under the vast Montana sky filled with stars and possibilities, Rebecca Morgan was simply grateful to be alive, to be free, and to be surrounded by people who understood that true strength came not from dominating others but from lifting them up. The wagon wheels rolled quietly through the darkness toward home, carrying a woman who had refused to be broken by circumstances, a man who had found redemption through service to others, and a child whose innocent questions had somehow changed the world in ways that would echo through generations to come. 2 years had passed since the first shooting star Rebecca Morgan had wished upon, and the autumn winds that swept through Copper Ridge carried with them the scent of prosperity and purpose. The small town had
transformed from a collection of scattered buildings dominated by fear into a thriving community that drew families from across the Colorado Territory seeking opportunity and safety. Main Street bustled with legitimate businesses, the schoolhouse rang with children's laughter, and the newly constructed town hall bore a brass plaque that read "Rebecca Morgan, Mayor," in letters that caught the morning sunlight like promises kept. The Morgan Charitable Trust had become a beacon of hope throughout the region, providing assistance to over 300 families in its first 18 months of operation. Rebecca's insistence on dignity and autonomy in the distribution of aid had created a model that other territories were beginning to emulate. Women facing destitution no longer had to choose between starvation and surrender, children no longer went without medicine, and families could rebuild their lives without sacrificing their self-respect in the process. Sam Mitchell stood in the doorway of his expanded ranch house, watching his wife tend to the vegetable garden that had become her pride and joy despite her numerous municipal responsibilities. They had married the previous spring in a ceremony that brought together federal marshals and former outlaws, territorial officials and struggling homesteaders, creating a celebration that reflected the complex tapestry of their shared history. Rebecca wore her late mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her frame, while Tommy served as ring-bearer with the solemn importance of a 6-year-old entrusted with adult responsibilities. The marriage had surprised no one who knew them, though the depth of their contentment together continued to amaze even their closest friends. Two people scarred by loss and hardship had found healing in each other's company, building a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of quiet love that deepened with each passing day. Their home had become an unofficial gathering place for the community, where federal agents planning investigations sat at the same table as reformed criminals seeking honest work. Tommy burst through the kitchen door with the enthusiasm of childhood, his school books forgotten in his excitement to share the day's adventures. He had grown tall for his age, inheriting his mother's intelligence and his stepfather's steady temperament, while maintaining the curious nature that had once changed a criminal's heart with a simple question about cowboys. The boy who had asked Jake Sullivan whether he was good or bad now spent his afternoons helping his mother distribute supplies to needy families, learning through example that true strength came from service to others. "Mama, Sam," Tommy called out, using the informal address that reflected the easy affection between stepfather and son. Mrs. Patterson says there's going to be a new railroad spur coming through Copper Ridge. She says it'll bring more people and more businesses, and maybe even a real hotel with electric lights. Rebecca looked up from her garden with soil-stained hands and a smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. The years of responsibility and purpose had given her a confidence that radiated from within, making her the kind of woman other women looked to for guidance and men respected for her wisdom rather than desired for her appearance alone. Electric lights would certainly be something to see, Rebecca agreed, wiping her hands on her apron. Though I hope all this progress doesn't change the character of our community too much. Part of what makes Copper Ridge special is that people know each other, that neighbors look out for each other. Sam joined them in the garden, his deputy marshal's badge catching the afternoon sunlight as he moved with the easy confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. His work with Rose Carter's federal task force had taken him throughout the territory, investigating corruption and dismantling criminal operations, but he always returned to Copper Ridge with relief and gratitude for the stability his family provided. Speaking of neighbors looking out for each other, Sam said, pulling a telegram from his coat pocket, "This came through the marshal's office this afternoon. It's from the territorial governor." Rebecca's expression grew serious as she accepted the telegram, knowing that official communications often brought new challenges or responsibilities. She read the message twice before looking up with an expression of amazement and perhaps a touch of apprehension. "What is it?" Tommy asked, sensing the significance of the moment despite his youth. "The governor wants to nominate me for territorial representative to the statehood convention," Rebecca said slowly, as if speaking the words aloud might make them more believable. "If Colorado achieves statehood, I would help write the new state constitution." The implications of such an appointment were staggering. Rebecca Morgan, the widow who had once faced destitution and considered a marriage of desperation, was being asked to help shape the fundamental laws of a new state. Her transformation from victim to leader would be complete, her voice carrying weight in the highest levels of government. Sam whistled softly, clearly impressed by the recognition his wife had earned. "That's quite an honor, Rebecca, though I can't say I'm surprised. Your work here in Copper Ridge has attracted attention throughout the territory." "What does a territorial representative do?" Tommy asked with the directness that had become his trademark. Rebecca knelt down to meet her son at eye level, choosing her words carefully. "A territorial representative helps decide what rules and laws will govern how people live together in harmony. They try to make sure everyone is treated fairly and has the opportunity to build good lives for their families." "Like you do here in Copper Ridge," Tommy pressed. "Exactly like that," Rebecca confirmed, "but for the entire state instead of just our town." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar figure riding up the lane toward their house. Rose Carter dismounted with the fluid grace of someone equally comfortable in a Washington drawing room or on a frontier trail, her federal marshal's uniform impeccably maintained despite the dust of hard travel. The years had been kind to her as well, with her success in reforming territorial law enforcement earning her a reputation that extended far beyond Colorado. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," Rose called out as she approached the family group. "Though judging by the serious expressions, I'd guess you've already received the governor's telegram." "You knew about this?" Rebecca asked, rising to embrace her friend with genuine warmth. "I may have provided some input when the governor asked for recommendations," Rose admitted with a smile. "Your work with the charitable trust and your leadership here in Copper Ridge have made you something of a legend in territorial government circles." Sam chuckled at his wife's obvious discomfort with such praise. Rebecca has never been comfortable with recognition, even when it's well-deserved. "That's exactly why she's perfect for the position," Rose replied seriously. "We need leaders who serve because they believe in justice, not because they crave power or recognition." The statehood convention will be dealing with complex issues: women's suffrage, mining rights, railroad regulation, treatment of native populations. These decisions will affect generations of Coloradans. Rebecca found herself contemplating the weight of such responsibility. The opportunity to influence the fundamental structure of a new state was both thrilling and terrifying, offering the chance to ensure that Colorado's constitution reflected the values of fairness and human dignity that she had fought to establish in Copper Ridge. "There's something else you should know," Rose continued, her expression growing more serious. "The appointment would require you to spend several months in Denver during the Constitutional Convention.
It's a significant commitment that would take you away from your family and your work here. The practical implications of accepting such a position were daunting. Rebecca's responsibilities as mayor and administrator of the charitable trust had grown to fill most of her waking hours, and the thought of abandoning these duties to pursue higher office seemed almost selfish. Yet the opportunity to advocate for the rights and welfare of all Colorado families was incredibly appealing. Tommy tugged at his mother's skirt, demanding attention with the impatience of childhood. "Mama, would you have to go away like when Papa went to heaven? Would you not come back?" The innocent question cut straight to Rebecca's heart, reminding her that any decision she made would affect not just her own future but the security and happiness of her son. She gathered Tommy into her arms, holding him close as she considered how to balance personal ambition with family responsibility. "No, sweetheart," she said gently. "If I decided to accept this appointment, I would only be gone for a few months, and then I would come home to you and Sam. It wouldn't be permanent like what happened to Papa." Sam moved closer, placing a supportive hand on Rebecca's shoulder. "Whatever you decide, we'll make it work. Tommy and I are perfectly capable of managing things here for a few months, and the experience of helping write a state constitution is something that comes along once in a lifetime." The vote of confidence from her husband meant everything to Rebecca, but she could see the concern in his eyes despite his supportive words. Their marriage was still relatively new, built on shared experiences of trauma and recovery, and an extended separation would test the bonds they had carefully constructed. "I need time to think about this," Rebecca said finally. "It's not a decision to be made lightly, and there are so many factors to consider." Rose nodded understandingly. "Of course, the governor doesn't need an answer for 2 weeks, so you have time to weigh all the implications. But I will say this, your voice at that convention could make the difference between a constitution that protects the vulnerable, and one that simply serves the interests of the powerful." As Rose prepared to leave, she pulled Rebecca aside for a private conversation. "There's one more thing you should know about the statehood convention. Jake Sullivan has been corresponding with several of the delegates, offering his perspective on territorial governance from his prison cell." Rebecca felt a familiar chill at the mention of that name. Despite the passage of time and the security of her new life, Jake Sullivan's shadow still had the power to disturb her peace of mind. What kind of perspective could he possibly offer from prison? "He's been writing extensively about the relationship between legitimate authority and criminal enterprise," Rose explained. "His letters detail how corruption spreads through territorial government, and what safeguards might prevent future abuses. Some of the delegates find his insights valuable, given his intimate knowledge of the system's weaknesses." The irony of Jake Sullivan influencing Colorado's constitution from his prison cell was both disturbing and strangely appropriate. The man who had built an empire on human suffering was now attempting to ensure that future constitutions would prevent similar abuses of power. It was as if his imprisonment had completed the transformation that began with Tommy's innocent question about good and bad cowboys. "Does he mention me in these letters?" Rebecca asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to know the answer. Rose smiled gently. "Actually he does. He writes about the importance of having leaders who understand what it means to face impossible choices, who have experienced hardship without losing their moral compass. He specifically cites your example as the kind of character Colorado needs in its foundational government." The unexpected endorsement from her former tormentor was both validating and unsettling. Rebecca had spent 2 years building a life defined by her own choices rather than Jake Sullivan's influence, and the thought that he was still affecting her destiny from behind prison walls was difficult to accept. That evening, after Tommy had been tucked into bed with stories of constitutional conventions explained in terms a 6-year-old could understand, Rebecca and Sam sat on their front porch watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The peace of their domestic routine provided a stark contrast to the weighty decision Rebecca faced, and she found herself torn between the comfort of familiar responsibilities and the call of larger service. "You want to accept the appointment," Sam observed quietly, reading the conflict in his wife's expression with the intuition born of deep love and understanding. "Part of me does," Rebecca admitted. "The opportunity to help shape a state constitution, to ensure that Colorado's laws protect people like us, people who face desperate circumstances. It's incredibly appealing, but," Sam prompted gently, "but I'm afraid," Rebecca said honestly. "Afraid of leaving you and Tommy, afraid of failing at something so important, afraid of losing sight of what really matters in pursuit of grand gestures." Sam took her hand in his, the simple gesture providing the anchor of connection she needed to sort through her conflicted emotions. "You know, when I first met you, you were facing the most impossible choice imaginable: marry a criminal to save your son or face destitution in the middle of winter, and you chose integrity over security, principle over pragmatism." "That was different," Rebecca protested. "That was about protecting Tommy. This is about my own ambitions." "Is it?" Sam asked. "Or is it about protecting hundreds of thousands of future Coloradans from the kind of systemic corruption that enabled Jake Sullivan's operation? Because if the Constitution doesn't include proper safeguards, other Sullivans will arise to fill the void." The observation crystallized Rebecca's internal struggle in ways she hadn't previously considered. Her potential service at the Constitutional Convention wasn't about personal advancement, but about extending the same protection she had fought to establish in Copper Ridge to every corner of the new state. It was about ensuring that future families facing desperate circumstances would have legal recourse and constitutional protections. "You think I should accept," Rebecca said, though it was more statement than question. "I think you should do what you believe is right," Sam replied. "Just like you did when Jake Sullivan offered you security in exchange for your freedom. Trust your instincts, Rebecca, they've never led you astray." The following morning brought unexpected visitors to Copper Ridge in the form of a delegation from the territorial capital. 3 distinguished gentlemen in expensive suits dismounted from a well-appointed carriage, their formal attire and officious manner marking them as government officials of considerable importance. They moved with the self-conscious dignity of men accustomed to deference and unquestioned authority. Rebecca received them in the town hall, flanked by Sam and accompanied by several members of the town council who had been hastily summoned for the occasion. The lead delegate, a portly man with an elaborate mustache and gold watch chain, introduced himself as Territorial Secretary Harrison Walsh, a name Rebecca recognized from newspaper accounts of territorial politics. "Mrs. Morgan." Secretary Walsh began with the unctuous tone of a politician delivering prepared remarks. "I trust you've had time to consider the governor's generous offer of appointment to the Constitutional Convention." "I have been giving it serious consideration," Rebecca replied carefully, noting the man's assumption that she would view the appointment as a generous gift rather than a responsibility to be weighed carefully. "Excellent, excellent," Walsh continued, apparently interpreting her diplomatic response as enthusiasm. "The governor is particularly interested in having a woman's perspective represented at the convention, especially someone with your unique background and experiences." There was something in the way he emphasized unique background that made Rebecca's instincts prickle with warning. She glanced at Sam, who had clearly picked up on the same undertone of condescension masked as compliment. "What exactly do you mean by unique background?" Rebecca asked with the directness that had become her trademark in municipal affairs. Walsh's smile faltered slightly, as if he hadn't expected to be challenged on his phrasing. "Well, your rise from, shall we say, humble circumstances to a position of community leadership. Your personal experience with the challenges facing ordinary families. These perspectives would be valuable in crafting legislation that addresses the needs of Colorado's working people." The explanation sounded reasonable on its surface, but Rebecca sensed there was more to the delegation's visit than simple encouragement of her potential appointment. Government officials didn't travel from the territorial capital to have casual conversations with small-town mayors, regardless of their potential constitutional roles. "Secretary Walsh," she said formally, "I appreciate the governor's confidence in my abilities, but I sense there may be additional considerations you haven't yet mentioned. What exactly does the territorial government expect from my potential service?" The 3 delegates exchanged glances, apparently surprised by Rebecca's perceptiveness. Walsh cleared his throat before responding with the careful precision of a man choosing his words for maximum political effect. "The Constitutional Convention will be dealing with several controversial issues," he admitted. "Women's suffrage, for instance, and the regulation of mining operations. There are competing interests that must be balanced carefully." "Competing interests," Rebecca repeated flatly, "such as?" "The mining companies have legitimate concerns about over-regulation stifling economic development," Walsh explained. "Railroad interests worry about restrictions on expansion. Business leaders throughout the territory want assurance that the new constitution won't impose unreasonable burdens on commerce and industry." The picture was becoming clearer with each word. The territorial government wasn't seeking Rebecca's appointment because they valued her perspective on protecting vulnerable families. They wanted her because they believed her background would make her sympathetic to business interests, that her experience with poverty would make her prioritize economic development over workers' rights. Sam's jaw had tightened as he listened to the delegates' barely concealed agenda. So you're hoping Mrs. Morgan will vote to protect business interests because she understands the importance of economic opportunity. We're hoping she'll bring a practical perspective to the convention, Walsh replied smoothly. Someone who understands that economic growth benefits everyone, that overly restrictive regulations can harm the very people they're intended to protect. Rebecca felt a familiar anger building in her chest, the same fury that had sustained her through Jake Sullivan's threats and the long months of legal proceedings that followed. These men had fundamentally misunderstood her character and her motivations, assuming that survival would make her compliant rather than determined to prevent others from facing similar struggles. Gentlemen, she said with icy politeness, I think there may be some confusion about my potential priorities as a constitutional delegate. Let me clarify my position on several key issues. The delegates leaned forward expectantly, apparently confident that they would hear reassuring platitudes about business-friendly governance and moderate approaches to social reform. First, Rebecca continued, I believe that any constitution worthy of the name must include explicit protections for workers' rights, including safe working conditions, fair wages, and the right to organize for collective bargaining. Walsh's confident expression began to falter as he realized this conversation wasn't proceeding as planned. Second, I believe that women's suffrage is not a controversial issue but a fundamental right that should be enshrined in the Constitution without equivocation or compromise. The second delegate, who had remained silent until this point, cleared his throat nervously. Mrs. Morgan, perhaps we should discuss the practical implications of such positions. Extreme stances could alienate moderate delegates and prevent the passage of any constitution at all. Third, Rebecca continued as if he hadn't spoken, I believe that the Constitution must include strong anti-corruption measures and transparency requirements that make it impossible for future Jake Sullivans to purchase government protection for their criminal enterprises. The reference to Sullivan's operation sent a visible shiver through the delegation. They clearly hadn't expected such direct confrontation with the reality of territorial corruption, preferring to discuss governance in abstract terms that didn't implicate existing power structures. Mrs. Morgan, Walsh said slowly, I fear there may have been some miscommunication about the nature of your potential appointment. The Constitutional Convention requires delegates who can work constructively with all stakeholders, who understand the need for compromise and moderation. What you mean, Rebecca replied with perfect clarity, is that you want delegates who will prioritize business interests over human rights, who will compromise away protections for vulnerable people in the name of political expedience. The truth hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. These men had come to Copper Ridge, expecting to find a grateful woman who would serve their agenda in exchange for the honor of appointment. Instead, they had encountered someone who understood exactly what they were asking, and had the courage to reject it completely. Sam stepped forward slightly, his hand resting casually on the grip of his gun in a gesture that wasn't quite threatening, but definitely got the delegates' attention. I think Mrs. Morgan has made her position quite clear, gentlemen. Perhaps it's time for you to return to the territorial capital and inform the governor that his potential appointee has principles that can't be bought or intimidated. The delegates rose from their chairs with the stiff dignity of men who had been thoroughly outmaneuvered by opponents they had underestimated. Walsh straightened his coat and attempted to recover some semblance of official authority. This conversation has been illuminating, he said carefully. I trust you'll give further consideration to the practical realities of constitutional governance before making any final decisions. Oh, I will, Rebecca assured him. I'll consider them very carefully indeed. After the delegation had departed in their expensive carriage, leaving a cloud of dust and wounded dignity in their wake, Rebecca stood in the doorway of the town hall contemplating the morning's revelations. The territorial government's attempt to co-opt her appointment had backfired spectacularly, but it had also clarified her thinking about the Constitutional Convention in ways she hadn't anticipated. Tommy appeared at her elbow with the sudden materialization that seemed to be a special talent of 6-year-old boys. Mama, were those men trying to make you do something you didn't want to do? The innocent question struck Rebecca with its perfect accuracy. That was exactly what had just occurred. Powerful men attempting to coerce her compliance through a combination of false flattery and veiled threats. It was Jake Sullivan's offer all over again, dressed in the language of political opportunity rather than marriage proposals. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, gathering her son into her arms. "They wanted me to promise to vote their way if I became a constitutional delegate, but that's not how integrity works, is it?" "No," Tommy agreed with the moral certainty of childhood. "You have to do what's right even when it's hard." The wisdom of her son's simple statement crystallized Rebecca's decision about the constitutional appointment. She would accept the position, but on her own terms and with her own agenda. If the territorial government wanted a delegate who would fight for workers' rights, women's suffrage, and anti-corruption measures, they would get exactly that whether they liked it or not. Sam joined them in the doorway, his expression showing a mixture of pride and concern for his wife's confrontational approach to territorial politics. "You realize you've probably made some powerful enemies this morning."
"Good,"
Rebecca replied with surprising vehemence. "I'd rather have powerful enemies who know where I stand than powerful friends who think they own me." The weeks that followed brought a flurry of activity as Rebecca prepared for her departure to Denver and the Constitutional Convention. The charitable trust required extensive arrangements to ensure continuity of operations during her absence, while her mayoral duties needed to be temporarily delegated to trusted council members. Most challenging of all was the emotional preparation required to leave her family for several months while engaging in political battles that could define Colorado's future for generations. Rose Carter arrived the day before Rebecca's scheduled departure, bringing with her a leather portfolio filled with research materials and strategic recommendations for the Constitutional Convention. The two women spent the evening reviewing delegate profiles, analyzing potential alliances, and planning approaches to the complex issues that would dominate the proceedings. "The mining interests will have at least 12 delegates firmly in their pocket," Rose explained, spreading documents across Rebecca's kitchen table. "The railroad companies control another 8 or 9 votes. Your challenge will be building a coalition of delegates who prioritize human rights over corporate profits." Rebecca studied the delegate profiles with the intensity of a general planning a military campaign. Each name represented a potential ally or opponent in the battle to shape Colorado's fundamental laws, and the stakes could not have been higher for the families whose futures hung in the balance. "What about Jake Sullivan's correspondence with the delegates?" Rebecca asked. "You mentioned that some of them find his insights valuable." Rose's expression grew thoughtful. "His letters have actually been quite helpful in identifying delegates who are genuinely committed to reform versus those who are simply paying lip service to anti-corruption
measures. The delegates who dismiss his warnings about systemic corruption are usually the ones who benefit from that corruption." The irony of using Jake Sullivan's prison correspondence as a political litmus test was not lost on Rebecca. The man who had once represented everything wrong with territorial governance was now serving as an unwitting ally in the fight for constitutional reform. His transformation from criminal mastermind to inadvertent reformer was perhaps the strangest aspect of her entire political education. Tommy spent the evening helping his mother pack, carefully folding clothes and asking endless questions about constitutional conventions and state governments. His innocent curiosity about the democratic process served as a reminder of why Rebecca's work mattered, why the fight for just laws was worth the personal sacrifice it required. "Will you write me letters about what happens at the convention?" Tommy asked as Rebecca tucked him into bed for their last night together before her departure. "Every day," Rebecca promised, smoothing his hair with the tender gesture of a mother trying to memorize the feeling of her child's trust. "And I'll tell you about all the important decisions we make and why they matter for your future. Will you make sure the Constitution protects families like ours?" Tommy asked with the directness that had become his signature. "That's exactly what I'm going to do," Rebecca assured him. "I'm going to fight to make sure that no child in Colorado ever has to worry about having enough food or a safe place to live." Sam walked her to the stagecoach the following morning, carrying her traveling bags and offering final words of encouragement for the battles ahead. The platform was crowded with well-wishers from throughout Copper Ridge, reflecting the community's pride in having one of their own represent them at such a crucial moment in territorial history. "Remember," Sam said as the stage driver prepared to depart, "you're not just representing Copper Ridge at this convention. You're representing every family that's ever faced impossible choices, every woman who's ever been told her voice doesn't matter, every child who deserves a better future than their parents could provide." Rebecca kissed her husband goodbye with the passion of a woman who understood that love was measured not in time spent together but in shared commitment to principles worth fighting for. As the stagecoach pulled away from Copper Ridge, she watched her home disappear behind a cloud of dust and mountain peaks, carrying with her the hopes and dreams of a community that had learned to believe in the possibility of justice. The constitutional convention that would transform Colorado from territory to state was about to begin, and Rebecca Morgan was ready to ensure that the document they produced would protect the vulnerable, empower the voiceless, and prevent future Jake Sullivans from building empires on human suffering. The woman who had once been offered a mountain of sons in exchange for her submission was about to help birth a state founded on the radical proposition that all people deserve dignity, opportunity, and protection under the law. As the stagecoach rolled toward Denver and the most important work of her life, Rebecca Morgan smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her voice and intended to use it to change the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.